Well, thanks everybody for coming and for this to be a conversation. Questions and comments are encouraged throughout the presentation. Our speakers are Meg Cooch on her last day with ARC of Illinois and Josh Evans from IARF. So Meg Cooch is serving as the executive director of the ARC of Illinois for the rest of today. This following 20 years of nonprofit policy, advocacy, and organizing experience with working with people with disabilities of all ages and families and community organizations. With the ARC, she works to ensure that people with disabilities can live full lives in the community. Prior to moving to Chicago, she worked on federal level disability policy in DC and aging and disability advocacy in San Francisco. Meg has a bachelor's degree from the University of Virginia and a master's degree in public policy from Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. Josh Evans became president and CEO of IARF on April 1st, 2018, after nearly 15 years of working to advance the budget and policy priorities of the association through the Illinois General Assembly and the US Congress. During his tenure as Vice President of Government Relations and Operations, Legislative Director and Legislative Liaison, Josh led IARF efforts to pass several initiatives into law, managed grassroots advocacy campaigns to protect funding for community-based services and supports, and represented IARF on many broad-based coalition efforts. Josh currently serves on the board of directors of the American Network of Community Options and Resources, ANCHOR, where he is also the chair of the State Association Executives Committee and co-chair of the Government Relations Advisory Committee. He caught his first fish at age 37. It was a bluegill. I think it's remarkable that it took so long. Okay, so, and finally, for me, while I think almost all of you, as fellow association members or coworkers, I wanna give a slightly different introduction of myself. A couple of family events before my time shaped my life and probably yours too. My grandma was the oldest and sometimes the caregiver of 4 siblings. 2 of them used Illinois institutional care. My grandma was raising children of her own when she sent her sister some birthday flowers to learn that B, who had a developmental disability, had passed away and been buried in a pauper's grave, location unknown and never found. And I don't remember why the family was never notified, but there was, ever since that time, no trust for state care of any kind. So then the 4th of my grandparents' children was a very beautiful, quiet girl, and she was doted on by the older kids, so she didn't need to speak for herself. And then when it became clear that she couldn't, they suspected a hearing loss, but that wasn't it. When she was about 5, she disappeared for a whole day, and the Joliet police found her playing by herself at a school playground just a few miles away from the house. Over 60 years later, her little brother, who'd been probably 4 at the time, confessed, and he wasn't aware of the manhunt. He confessed that they did this all the time. They went down to that playground all the time. So for all those years of my aunt's life, there was hypervigilance about her running away and getting lost, even though she had never been lost in the first place. My grandparents had no interest in the only option that was offered for her care, which was institutional care several hours away. And instead, they became highly motivated, co-founded the Trinity School in 1950, and were among the first members of ARC. So, and they were lifelong supporters of ARC. So I feel very happy to bring the circle together on Meg's last day with the ARC. So anyway, with that, I will stop talking and let the presentation begin.
Lynn, thank you so much for sharing that. Wow, I would love to talk to you more about that at some point in time. And I think it actually, I really appreciate that introduction because I think it sets us focused on where we really need to be, which is the people who want to live their lives in the way they want to live their lives in their communities, and the organizations and the family members and allies that support them. So thank you very much for bringing it that way. And thank you for welcoming us in that lovely introduction today, and having me. I kind of said to Jody, this is my last day. Are you sure you want me? And she's like, oh yeah, that's great. So thank you very much for welcoming. So hopefully folks can see our slides in front of us. We actually are not, Josh was almost whacked my hand out of, or, whacked the PowerPoint out of my hand kind of idea is really, this is going to be, and we would like this to be a discussion amongst us. We have people on this call that are from all over the state. And I think it's a value, frankly, selfishly, to the two of us to hear from you and your experiences about these three areas. We plan on talking a little bit about, from our perspectives, about COVID-19 and the impact of it thus far. Talk a little bit about bright spots, because we need to talk about as many bright spots as possible these days and really lift those up. And then talk about really looking forward. So our advocacy priorities and opportunities, both related to COVID and beyond, because I think the hope out of this whole pandemic is that when we come and look at services and supports following, it's not just that we've returned to the old, but in fact, we've looked at how we can really transform and what lessons learned that we've had during this time. So just before we get started, I like cartoons. So, here's a cartoon in front of you that I just think sometimes, at least in my journey over the last year, has been at points where I felt this way. And it has people running out of a tube that's 2020 and into a tunnel that's 2021. And it says, look, a light at the end of another tunnel. And I feel like I would expect that you all have felt this way over the last year of the kind of this ride. There's really high spots of we're doing it, we're making it. And then there's times when it feels like we're entering another tunnel. So hopefully we are really seeing, with the vaccinations that people were talking about earlier, that we're really seeing that light really come through. But I think we're going to talk first about COVID-19 impacts. And I guess I wanted to kick it over to Josh to kind of introduce himself or comment, and then kind of tee us up on COVID impact.
Sure, Meg, thank you. And if I put my face too close to the screen, I apologize. I have somewhat of a inconsistent mic gain on my end. So hopefully if I break up, someone just kind of yell or put something into the chat. First off, thank you everyone for all that you do as county boards. I think it should be evident, but I don't think it can be said enough about the important role that you play in funding services in your local communities. All of you are well aware of how, unfortunately, Medicaid, while it's supposed to cover the cost of care, rarely is able to do so. And if not for the ability of your organizations to help offset and fund services and supports, I shudder to think about what some of our waiting lists would look like, even though we have probably one of the 5th highest waiting lists in the country. So thank you for including me today. Thank you for all that you do. And please don't be offended again by my casual wear. I fully embraced the Zoom lifestyle when I'm at home. I've tried to do suits, but it just doesn't work out for me in this environment. But and then certainly last but not least, before I dive in, I just want to say how much of an incredible honor it has been to work with Meg these last few years. She is an incredible leader, an incredible advocate. She has been welcoming and working with provider organizations since she came in. And while I'm always sad when someone, leaves an interaction that one is used to, I think it's going to be amazing when she goes into the division of DD because of her background and experience. And I think she will just enhance what is already an exceptional division in terms of setting direction for community-based services and supports in Illinois. So with that being said, impact, wow. So it's not, it isn't said enough, frankly, that in our services and support arena, one of the greatest difficulties we experience on a year-over-year basis are staffing challenges. Predominantly, how do you recruit and retain quality direct support professionals? How do you ensure your frontline supervisors are properly trained and get the education they need to be in the supervisory role? And as evidenced by some of the work that was done in the past couple of state fiscal years, where we've taken a bit of a Band-Aid approach to try to address wage rate components for staff, we had challenges coming into this pandemic that you would understand naturally were exacerbated significantly when March came of last year, and organizations had to take a hard look at what their expectations were of themselves and their staff, to shift to what was predominantly, and still is in a lot of respects, a health and safety first mindset in supporting adults with developmental disabilities, as opposed to a community integration, interaction, realization, American dream approach that one hopes that our community-based providers are engaging in. So what came with that, thankfully, though, is we had a division of developmental disabilities that has leadership with provider experience and recognized that certain steps needed to be taken immediately to try to address some of those pressures. One was our community day service option, of which there are 100 plus community day service providers in communities across the state that many of you know teach activities of daily living, work with individuals to seek integrated employment. Those site-based services were closed down to prevent the spread of the COVID vaccine in March, I believe the 17th. I could be wrong by a day or two, sticks out in my head. And, that was, I think, a significant moment in the pandemic last year by which early action by our division to put those organizations down for the time being has helped, I think, a lot of our residential providers essentially mitigate the spread of the coronavirus early on. And I think bought a lot of providers significant time to learn from one another and colleagues on how staffing models would need to change, on the types and the amount of PPE they would need to obtain, and as well as continue to learn from the public health space what changes and practices needed to be done to try to promote health and safety, both for staff, but predominantly individuals that were served and supported and continue to be today. Thankfully, our division was able to put in place some rate adjustments that continue today to try to help with the staffing issues, especially for overtime pay, hazard pay. That corresponds with a lot of situations on the residential side where we had a lot of heroes that agreed to engage and live in models with residents in our group homes. Can't be said enough about the amazing work that the DSP's did during this pandemic with those significant changes, knowing that the work-life balance, which can always be difficult, was completely thrown out of whack. And the dedication, I hope, as we're able to be in a different place months and years from now, we can look back on the important role of paid and unpaid caregivers to what I think make a significant impact in Illinois, specifically on avoiding what could have been a widespread spread of the virus in all of our settings. And I think that that was due to a partnership of leadership from our division of DD in terms of being able to help us set policy, help us get rates that were needed to continue services where they were allowed, but also to provide retainer payments to our community day service organizations to keep that basic infrastructure in place with the understanding that we are going to get through this eventually, and we want that infrastructure in some way, shape, or form to be in place when we come on the quote unquote other side of this. It also allowed us to, as statewide organizations, to recognize in this unusual situation, we need to do as much as we could to share and share alike. We initiated weekly calls at one point with the ARC of Illinois, the Institute, the center, and groups to just try to ensure that we brought provider staff and leadership together so they felt connected with one another, so that they would know what was going on, how an organization may have responded to a case in a group home or an ICFD setting in what they did. And I think without leadership, both in and outside of government, at the provider level, at the association level, without that, who knows where we could have ended up. I want to believe on the, somewhat past a year later, I just think that Illinois did an exceptional job on behalf of persons with developmental disabilities and putting procedures in place and putting investments in place where they needed to be. And I think that we did an extremely good job as a state in preventing the spread. Unfortunately, there were casualties as a result. Unfortunately, no one wants that to be the case, but I think we were probably better prepared as a result of leadership. And I know I can't thank leaders like Meg and others that were well connected with family organizations and in organizations like the Division of DD and our members. So we muscled through it. And right now, I would think we've got a lot of tired execs. More importantly, we have a lot of tired supervisors, a lot of tired DSPs as we try to and continue to get the vaccination uptake in the regions of the state. And we're going to now need to transition into that resiliency mode towards growth of opportunity and get back into what we do best. We like to think we do best, which is community-based integration and helping individuals realize dreams. So my apologies, Meg, I may have gone a bit over for into your next part, but I kind of have a gift of, or a curse of going off on some tangents.
Gift of gab. That's great. No, this is supposed to be casual, remember? Casual. No, not heavy slides. So, thank you, Josh, for, I think, I guess I would echo Josh in a couple of regards. I think he did a great job kind of presenting where we were. And actually, you kind of brought me back a little bit. I feel like it's been now a year that I've almost forgotten a little bit, or it's softened the edges of what March and April looked like in terms of people really being fearful about what was it going to be like nursing homes, in group homes, and unfortunately mortality rates, where were they going to be, and that sort of thing. And then just finding, safety gear, PPE, and that it was really a struggle. And I do want to echo about partnerships. I'd be actually really interested if anyone's willing to write in the chat about partnerships that you all did during this time, because I do think this has been an opportunity, and we saw it obviously at the state level, like with the division, and they did an incredible job of communication. I think DDD produced more communication during that time than like any other division. I don't have the number on that, but I'd be a betting woman to say that, because really every day there would be communication as much as they possibly could offer clarity from both the funding perspective and the regulatory perspective of what people needed to do and where they had flexibility. Because I think that was a big thing, and I guess probably a bright spot that we'll talk about in a minute, because I do think that there's been some flexibility that's been seen. And even though in a lot of ways safety and security sort of reigned during this time, and a little bit the dignity of risk had to step back for a bit, at the same time, I do think that there's some individualization of services and supports that we've seen in a different way that hopefully will be able to be retained. I did want to talk a little bit about kind of from where we were seeing things from the family and the self-advocate side, just in addition, kind of to round out what Josh has sort of outlined. We really saw people step up across the board. We heard a lot from families and from people around the isolation that, really across the country, in a world we've been experiencing. In a weird way, this has been an opportunity for equalization for people with IDD who already struggle to be really included in the community fully. Here's a situation where everyone else was sort of experiencing some of the isolation and the limitations that people who maybe couldn't always do what they want to do at night or on the weekends were experiencing. And I certainly hope, selfishly, from an advocacy perspective, legislators will remember that as we advocate for more funding for services, that as communities open up, people with IDD should have the ability to be experience inclusion and involvement as much as everyone else. And kind of with that isolation piece, I think there were some things that probably we already always knew, but became just really in stark relief. One was around digital divide. From state operated developmental centers where there is no Wi-Fi pretty much anywhere, to even a lot of group homes didn't have, maybe they had a hardwired one computer, but they had very minimal technology that they could utilize to connect people the way we kind of jumped right into with Zoom. And so really there was a push that I'll talk about a little bit with Bright Spots around trying to connect people better and bridge that technology divide, which hopefully will really set us up on the other end of this in a way, in a unique way, to really take advantage of telemedicine, telehealth, and just connection points for people that maybe can't get out all the time. We saw really a crisis or a real major concern around people that didn't live with their families and visitation. So that was a major a challenge for people, that they were really isolated in their own home, whether it be a group home or an intermediate care facility, that their family, which they regularly saw, now they couldn't see anymore, which again, something that we all experience, but created different tensions in some ways. we also saw barriers for families who were not connected with providers. We talk, and Josh and I work with a ton of providers around the state, but people that are in the home-based services program that live with families, or people that aren't receiving services, really had a hard time getting things like PPE, trying to go through the systems that were created were challenging enough, but then to be an individualized person or family, we see additional barriers. And we're seeing that same translation for vaccinations. So there remains this gap in communication and connection points for families who are not affiliated with a provider in some ways. And then the last thing I guess I would want to comment is just around school-aged and transition-age families. I assume some of the folks on this phone do kind of work in that realm. And, we heard from a lot of, obviously, I have 2 young kids at home, and I know Josh has a number as well, and probably folks here do. I personally struggled. It was really hard to balance all of that early on. And I think the system was not built for kids with disabilities to be at home during the day, during school. And so there have been huge barriers. I'm actually surprised there haven't been more lawsuits, frankly, right now, around people getting the appropriate access to services, personal support workers during the day. And the challenge that has impacted the families is pretty huge. And then there's a whole world, and later in the policy section, we could talk about this more if people are interested. There's a number of bills around transition age youth. And some of that is because we just generally need to address kids coming out of school, but some of that is because we've seen, kids where their IEP has been outlined to help support them to get work and to think about their lives. They weren't able to do anything in the last year. And so what is going to happen as folks matriculate out of school and then, either land on a couch and they've had even less preparation than usual. So that is also an area that we're incredibly concerned about and working on. I saw there were a couple of things in the chat. I don't know, Josh, if you.
So I tried to speak some, but I think one you should probably, I think would be of interest is, your observation of vaccination uptake by perhaps folks in home base or the general disability population, PSWs.
So for me, we've seen. So I mean, Josh could probably talk about this is probably in the policy and advocacy section, but we can talk about it here because it's what, I think in the beginning, we were really advocating strongly around clarity for regulation and for funding, and then for access to PPE. I feel like IR helped to lead an effort to get PPP out the door. I could only imagine what your office looked like with boxes at one point. And then I'd say over the last 3 months, it's really been vaccinations. And I think a bright spot that comes out of this is I think in the IDPH world, in the Department of Public Health world, and in public health in general, people with IDD are much more on the radar than I think they used to be, or at least those that don't live in institutions. And so because of advocacy really done, when the first vaccination plan came out, it included people in nursing homes, it included people, or at least staff in intermediate care facilities for the developmentally disabled, and it didn't include anyone else on the IDD side and disability side in general. And so through a lot of advocacy of a lot of different groups, it slowly added back people living in SILA group homes, and staff were added. Then all caregivers, family caregivers were added, which was pretty huge. And DHS did a letter basically saying that because that was an issue. Someone asked about people in home-based. So caregivers could start getting it, but then people, they aren't affiliated. They couldn't go to a service provider day of vaccinations. They had to go through the regular structure of everyone else. And were denied services a decent amount. And then we had to still advocate for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, regardless of where they live, because there were studies that were coming out saying that they were at higher risk. And so we finally were successful at the state just a few weeks ago when 1B+ was created for all people with disabilities. And even then, I live in Chicago proper, and Chicago and Cook County, we're still fighting that. I think now I think at this point, all people with disabilities are included. But I think it was an education point along the way, both in terms of arguing for population health, that we should be focused on all people with disabilities and IDD, but also about the fact that people live in different places but they still receive support. So, they still have people that come in and out of their house, and they should have access even if they're not in a large scale institution. And I would say that this last week, I've gotten much less frustrated emails from families. So I think although there's still some challenge, and I really wish, in the next pandemic, I hope they've learned their lesson and there's a much easier place for all people with disabilities and families to go and call and just get on, as opposed to having to go online and have that digital divide issue too. It was a process, but I do believe that we're in a much better place. And please share if your experience has been different, because I would love to know that and pass that along to our folks to advocate further. I don't know, Josh, has that been your experience?
I wouldn't disagree with you.
I will say just a shout out to a lot of providers and the division, in the effort to roll out vaccinations. There was a push to make sure all people living in group homes were vaccinated, but then there was sort of an allowance and a broadening of that to people in home base that went to community day programs. And that at some places like Trinity, for example, wound up just hosting for other smaller group homes around, hosting a vaccination space. One of the issues that we had to advocate and educate around is the challenges, especially sensory challenges, as well as other access issues as people think about vaccinations in large scale or general places. That certain groups, and I even 2 or 3 weeks ago, someone emailed about, well, some of the families we work with the kid can't wear a mask and they're requiring masking or screens, and that means they can't get the vaccine. And so it continues to be an education, I think, on ADA access and really understanding what access for people with IDD can really look like. So there's a question around, Josh or Meg, comment on the vaccination rate by CDS and SILA staff.
So I kind of threw some stuff in chat, but what I essentially put in chat is early on, ultimately the higher rate of vaccinations among staff are largely due to organizational leadership that tried to implement local campaigns, tried to implement as much very clear education for staff as possible. I was not aware, at least within our organization, of anybody that attempted to mandate it for staff. I don't think anybody wanted to try to get touching any legal issues there. Residents statewide, the uptake of the vaccine was very high. But I think you look at a bit of a political potential issue on vaccination, rural versus urban early on. But as we, were thankfully included in phase 1A, when vaccines got out, nobody developed a second head. There's no government tracking chip that we're aware of in any of the approved vaccines. You see the second point of vaccination, the uptake by staff, has increased. And we're very thankful for that. I know that the division stood up a statewide campaign. We tried to stand one up as well. DPH is in the process, I think, of continuing to do that. But as more folks, saw from their peers that, with the exception of maybe some limited symptoms, that folks weren't getting ill from this, and realized that they went through a rigorous process of approval, all of those rates across the board have come up.
I mean, I would say that I was driving to the office today, and they just announced a new survey that said about 70% of people either plan to have already taken at least one of the vaccinations in adults in the US. And I think I would expect that rise, to Josh's point, will continue. Christine, the 40% is what I had heard about. Maybe a tick more, depending on the provider. And you've seen that providers that have really done a very soft approach of identifying and surveying staff. And I mean, we had at one point on a statewide call, one provider really took us blow by blow through what they did, which was very intentional, using a mix of mostly soft power and identifying people on staff who were really thought well of and could speak to, and identifying people who were, yes, I want to take it, people that were maybes and people that were no's, and really focusing on the maybes and separating those out, and then, really pushing on that, and then moving to the no's. So you've seen there's some people were at a high of like 60+% of staff. People with disabilities, it's much higher. Actually, I was on a call not too long ago with the division and the Going Home Coalition, and they were saying that of the state operated developmental centers, if you remove SHOT, they were at 98% of residents had been vaccinated. With SHOT, it was a little bit, it was like 95 or 90 something. And with staff, outside of, it was pretty low still. I mean, SHOT was the lowest, and maybe there's a regional thing there, but around 30% of staff. So they were still working on staff, but that at least people with IDD there were much higher. And I would expect it would be higher in the community, but and hopefully continue to grow as time goes on. So someone, Donna, comments in the future, just for folks, future preparations for response, more considerations for families who are doing care at home. Yes, amen. For both young and adult children that have been included as home health workers, even unpaid. I was involved in advocating for these families, early access. Thank you very much then, Donna, for being involved to do that. Yeah, I think that's a huge issue. And I was really encouraged, frankly, when they finally moved it. They didn't say, they expanded 1A to include caregivers who live in. And so it wasn't specified paid or unpaid. It was just people that live. And that acknowledgement I actually thought was pretty huge, frankly. Anything else from Josh, from you about impact?
Moderating is so easy because people are using the chat. Really great.
Feel free to unmute yourself too. We're not, we're not shy here, clearly. So anyone that would like to actually share something verbally would be great too.
Well, I have a question on behalf of our committee, and it's not a bright spot question.
I'll keep it on the slide.
No, it's really negative, and it's really hard for me not to go negative. I gave you my family history, which is context for that. And, acknowledging that the system we have is driven by family concerns. And so we're really good at taking a protective posture, but some of us are concerned that the posture is too protective. And in just straightforwardly in our lives, there are SILAs. All of us have a connection to some SILAs, and not being able to enter the SILAs in order to monitor, some have formal monitoring obligations to those group homes, and others are just parents who want to see what's going on. So, given the recent news and given some of our histories, it has been very scary. And then I also have heard from the inside of those closed off worlds that at first, when, during the first iteration of lockdown, some staff were living in the group homes and no one else was coming. And this started to take a mental health toll on everyone until day program staff came along and joined, to give some variety and life to the day. So those are two different concerns about that very protective posture. I wasn't surprised that we were good at that. I'm glad, because life first, but we are sort of concerned about quality of life too. And those of us busybodies who can't get in kind of want to know.
So have you not been, so first of all, with SODCs, we asked about this at this recent meeting, and Equip for Equality is allowed to go in. I don't know if they're currently going in because I don't know what their organizational policy is, but they're the folks that sort of oversee on the state operated developmental side of things. And so they are supposed to be able to be going in right now because we were really concerned about that too. I'm sort of a believer this is where the digital divide is really helpful, or eliminating the digital divide is really helpful, because the more families can see people on the phone, the better. But I believe that DDD has now created a visitation page on their website, and I can try to scare it up and send it to Jody, that outlines who, because a lot of the more traditional ICF and state operated centers are really under IDPH, and IDPH decides what to do with them. And so they were really limited. And I know there was a ton of advocacy from family members about those. On the SILA side, I know 2/3 of our staff are mostly parents, as well as people with disabilities. And there was a lot of angst internally, as well as from what we were hearing from people and families. It really varied. The division wasn't as specific, left it a lot more up to the provider, which offered some opportunity and some frustration. But I believe that at least for outside, they're back open. And Josh, I thought that they were able to have more visitation than that at this point in time, but Lynn, are you not experiencing that?
So that's not my point. There
Okay.
was a long period of
Yeah.
time where we couldn't. And,
Yep.
you know, as much as we love our providers, and I think a lot of us on this call have really good relationships with the providers, all of this work is done against a really stark backdrop of
Yeah.
a history of really tragic situations, which would have been, maybe would have been mitigated by more eyes on. So I know that we don't strike a great balance in the system, but for a long period, there were no eyes on.
I don't think the ISCs are in the Scylla homes yet.
They aren't.
No, I don't think so. Last I talked to
Okay.
the one here,
I mean-
unless there was an issue, then they would maybe do garage visits or something. But they're not doing, it's just phone calls or videos.
It's a major concern. I mean, I also think your dignity of risk and getting out into the community is also a big concern. And I know there's a lot of community day programs that are chomping at the bit for people to go back. And they started to go back. And then with the last kind of big rise, there was sort of a pulling back. There's this virtual day option that's now been created, which I think you were bleeding into a bright spot, actually. So that's, on the positive side. But I think we have to advocate to really keep pushing. And that moves into the advocacy piece around really full funding of home and community-based services so that people really can, move from isolation to real full community participation as quickly as everyone else in the state.
Thank you.
Before,
That's great.
before we move off that, a couple of things, and I know I think I started with this. And look, I mean, the waiver service array is not built or shouldn't be built to be health and safety first. A lot of organizations take seriously what Meg said. It's about the dignity of risk where rules and regulations allow that to occur. And so, I don't think any organization was happy to have to pull back directionally in terms of focusing on health and safety first, but it's what we had to do. And you're right, it did expose the need to think critically and implement policy to midstream to try to mitigate that isolation and impact on mental health. Meg mentioned VDS, virtual day services, which was something that the bureaucracy was able to move quick on to stand up to try to connect individuals virtually with day service providers and others to provide some meaningful day opportunity. Additionally, staff that worked in group homes were empowered and expected to be able to provide meaningful day activities that they otherwise weren't supposed to be doing, as individuals were traditionally required to get out and integrate in the community on day services or employment. So we tried some things across the board internally to try to mitigate that sense of isolation, but there's no substitute to going about our lives as we were used to living them prior to the pandemic. And so, this does get into some bright spots, Meg will mention too, in that, you clearly in this environment recognize that you need to do some things differently. And more acceptance and broader utilization of technology is something that we've learned is important to all of our lives, and I expect will continue to be important to all of our lives. Generationally it will be different, but that has to be an expectation going forward. Meg, I think you're leading off on bright spots.
Well, so I guess I am. But before I do, so there was a question, and I don't know if Josh, you have other thoughts on this. There was a question around what's our experience around getting healthcare needs being accessed during this time. So dental visits, doctor visits, physical therapy, that sort of thing. I kind of mentioned that I've heard some positive things about telehealth, but then for some people it really hasn't worked. But I wondered if you had heard anything from providers around that.
Well, those are all essential staff. Our frontline staff were physicians, were all essential staff. Depending on maybe where you're at, the caseload of the family doc, how that family doc wanted to approach things like basic screenings. I think that has been contingent and dependent. I don't believe that the telehealth uptake was as expansive as I'd hoped it would be. But that being said, really provision of telehealth and residential services didn't exist that I was aware of in any meaningful way prior to the start of this pandemic, which is another thing that we've learned we need to try to figure out policy that works for individuals and families. There's no substitute for the direct family doc, primary care physician interaction, but you know, HFS had to open up the rules of telehealth for Medicaid when this all started, so that an infrastructure of some way, shape, or form could actually be built in to connect an individual that maybe needed to see a primary care doc. And that's still ongoing. How these rules are going to look like at the end of the day is a matter of debate in the General Assembly right now. So, you know, all things considered, I think bureaucracy moved as quickly as it could and did a lot of good. Clearly, we've been exposed to some things, but they need to do better. But, you know, just I guess more to the point, you know, have we heard from providers at my level about folks that were not allowed to go face to face to meet physicians? You know, I've not heard that, at least not at my level. But if it was system wide and across the board, I think that's something that we would have heard more about.
Mhm. And Ron, I'd say dental is like one of our psychology and dental are the two things that over and over our families are constantly looking for.
Sure.
So I'm unfortunately not surprised as you talked about that in the chat. So let's talk about, I guess, a few bright spots, just because I think it is important. I sometimes used to call it silver linings, and I was like, well, it's not. We would much prefer never having this happen, obviously, but there are, I think, some few moments where it's like, oh, this is something maybe we can hopefully take or bring with us. A couple of them I've mentioned already, but just to kind of tee some up, and I would love to hear what you think of as bright spots potentially for folks that are on the webinar today. So one thing I think, as I said before, I think people with IDD and kind of the scope of the services and supports that they receive and where people receive services and supports is a little bit top line, a little bit higher up in understanding for Illinois Department of Public Health. And ideally, hopefully, local health departments as well. I think, you know, a lot of people would say that SILLers are sort of hiding in plain sight. And in some ways, that's actually what we want, right? It's a home like any others. It should be, and people should be part of the community like any others. But then when things like this happen, there are some uniqueness and unique supports needed and touch points needed for people who live in situations. We've seen flexibility. So Josh talked a little bit about how organizations really had to alter, you know, how they did their work, regular work, residential, and then also community day. And I think that there's been some flexibility created. So there are some people who always just had to go to community day 5 days a week, get in the van and go. And even though they didn't want to, they wanted to retire. They were over, you know, they were aging. That was just not their thing to go to a large scale day program. Well, you know, there have been opportunities for those folks to be able to stay at home and actually receive either day services at home or just take a day off. That was never allowed before in the waiver. On the flip side of that, which
Oh,
a lot
is
of
it just
people don't. Oh, go ahead. Oh, and so really kind of balancing that, but allowing for more individualized options for people as we open up to try to be able to retain some of that ability for people to maybe stay at home in a day and then go to day services another day, and then maybe do community day where they go straight out into community another day and work another day. That would be kind of the vision of how we all live lives and how we would want people to be able to be supported. And I think we sort of have a little bit of a camel nose under the tent, I think, as far as thinking about this a little bit differently, or there's opportunities for it. I think also providers have an opportunity now to think about legacy programs that maybe were more traditional structure, larger scale day, where, you know, whether it be them or their board would say, oh, we can't possibly touch X, Y, and Z. Well, a lot of X, Y, and Z was closed for about 9 months. So then it's a conversation about, well, maybe we can rethink how we do this or start something different and more flexible or more community-based or smaller, because we're rethinking congregate, I think, in a lot of ways right now, and rethink that while we, you know, that we get sort of contingency payments and things like that for our more legacy programs. I think it'll be interesting in about 1.5 years, 2 years to see if we see any more transition away from some of those programs, because people have sort of realized, oh, maybe we don't need it in the same way. I think hopefully there's additional funding. We're going to talk about the rate study in just a little bit, but hopefully there'll be a move to more individualized supports. And I think we're revisiting, and hopefully out of this, we'll revisit what a meaningful day looks like, so that it is less flexible. It does create challenges for providers because it's much easier to say we're going to have someone 5 days a week for 7 hours a day. But at the same time, for people, I think having more flexibility, because as Community Day reopened, very few people went immediately 5 days a week for a full day. A lot of people did 2 days a week, or they did VDS, virtual day, and then they did in person, and kind of really started shaking that up in a different way. So I'll stop talking and see if Josh, if you have other thoughts of bright spots.
I just want to pick up where you left off on Meaningful Day. So before I got onto this webinar, I was wrapping up some analysis of a frontline supervisor and DSP survey that we've been running over the last couple of weeks. And this is probably more validation than surprise, but across the board for both frontline supervisors and DSPs, when asked about direct services and supports, meaningful and very meaningful scores for learning more about what a meaningful day means for both the DSP and frontline supervisor position, ranked the highest of any of the things that we asked for in that space. So it's proliferated across the state, and meaningful day is not a new concept, but it's very well understood, I think, by levels of all organizations, that what a meaningful day is, what it can mean, how one works to ensure an individual has a meaningful day is top of the mind for our frontline staff and our supervisors and providers across the state. I also agree with Meg. We were on this trajectory necessarily before the pandemic hit, and it is increased the need, I think, for ensuring that to the extent we can do as much individualized services and supports as possible, it needs to be done, and we need to be firmly on that path. I believe we have organizations that, and again, we have to understand we have a multi-generational service array need in terms of aging adults, as Meg mentioned, that had the opportunity to finally stay home and didn't have to go to CDS. And we have different expectations of family members, parents, and guardians for young adults coming into the system. It was said earlier by Lynn that it's a parent-driven system. It's a parent, guardian, individually driven system. And providers that are constantly in touch with what their individuals and families want are well aware of this. But we exist in this scenario where the needs and wants are driven, but it's also dictated by what the state is willing to pay for in their waivers and what they fund. And we're caught between that in a lot of respects. So to the extent providers can innovate, it is exclusively to what the state is able to pay and how they pay, and the limitations that may be in place by rule and policy. And we know our division of DD has been putting work in on that for some time. And I tend to share Meg's belief that, depending on funding in a year from now, I'm really excited to see what a meaningful day means for provider organizations and individuals across the state, and expect it. My hope is that it is more individualized for those that want that service option. I think we touched on some of the bright spots. I know it's 12:53 already. Some of the bright spots in the provider is resiliency of staff has been shown. The importance of social safety net providers and our public health space, I think, has been shown as long-term care DD providers, and the need for them to be integrated more in county-based public health response. I think because we learned in some counties, if DD providers were more integrated in the public health response system, they were able to get access to PPE and even vaccinations quicker. So that is a legacy bright spot that I think we'll see kind of form its way out. And actually, hopefully we never have to deal with a pandemic like this again in our lifetimes. But also, greater need for broadband access, use of technology for everyone. We all like to have our iPads. Some of us have 6-year-olds and 7-year-olds that like it too much. But that's definitely a bright spot, is a recognized need that Illinois needed to get off the dime in advancing things like remote supports, other types of enabling technology to promote as much independence as possible. And it's 12:50.
I was going to say, so I was going to just, I'm going to share my my PowerPoint. There's information about a DD relief fund that the council funded that's just in there, and I'll share that, and we'll just jump to go ahead in advocacy. And do you want to kick that? You're taking a drink, but I would say, Josh, if you want to kick it off with the rates piece.
Sorry about that. So here's where we're at as an organization, and I believe for the most part, all of us that work in this space right now are advocating for full funding of the Department of Human Services Ligus rate recommendations. The skinny is when the Judge Sharon Coleman found the state of Illinois. I assume everybody has familiarity with Ligus. If not, it is the Olmstead consent decree that has been in place for 10 years now that requires the state to ensure residents of ICFDDs have the opportunity to access community-based services, and that we move at a reasonable pace individuals off our rather large waiting list in the state of Illinois. And so the judge found us out of compliance and directed the state to look at the core issues that brought us out of compliance, and that was rates and reimbursements. Over 2 years, a stakeholder group directed by the department, including all major stakeholders, came together across 7 subcommittees. I think Meg ran 3, 7 maybe 5, 1, okay, across numerous subcommittees to put recommendations for rate changes in place. Those were costed out by Navigant Guidehouse, a third-party organization reviewing cost reports. They arrived at a 5-year plan with a price tag of $329 million for state fiscal year 22, which starts in July, which will be developed by the General Assembly over the next couple of months. All of those services supports matched by Medicaid, ideally looking at plugging gaps of unfunded services being provided now, ensuring frontline staff wage rate components, or at least 150% of the minimum wage, and trying to fund changes in some of the things that Meg and I have been talking about community day services and employment supports, ensuring that there are rates to help organizations that are serving individuals with complex medical and behavioral needs. A whole host of things are baked into that particular rate study. And what we're trying to do right now is explain what this rate study means to the General Assembly, why it needs to be funded in the opportunities that are coming federally and elsewhere to help fund that, and how we could get what is essentially the 5th largest GDP in the country, the state of Illinois, to be something to that effect in terms of how we invest in the types of services that we provide in the community. It's a heavy lift. I know that, but we're having as many good conversations as we can with members of the General Assembly so that they recognize that we have an opportunity here to dramatically improve our service array in a watershed moment by funding it. That's certainly, I know, one of the things that we're engaged in right now from a grassroots perspective.
And then I would really call, and I can share, we have a fact sheet, I'm sure Josh probably does too, and TDM, the They Deserve More does, about, I actually put in the, sorry, it's HB, not NH, HB, I put the bill numbers. There's an appropriations bill in the House and Senate. There's a resolution right now, I think, in the Senate. I don't know if we have a House number. And then there's SB 2382, which supports the idea of funding the rate study and also addressing the home-based services budget, which, you know, as costs go up, the budget's not going up at the same rate. So home-based services is the self-directed model of service. And that's really critical to keep that up in order for that people can remain either at home or in their community and really self-direct their services as an option. So there's lots of other bills that we'd be happy to talk about, but that one I think is really, those are really the critical ones in order to really increase the investment so that providers and, well, people with disabilities, families and providers can really jump off from some of the lessons learned in those bright spots and really transform, find a new system. The new normal is really a new, more robust system for people. I know we kind of ran it home, so any questions or comments, reactions?
I wanted to share, we will be faithful to this legislative advocacy. We share the same values. And regarding the system and values, I just want to say that I believe this so deeply. The system that we have is because of the values that we share. So if we don't like the system, we got to look at ourselves. And that leads me to the power of the anti-stigma work. You can see it in legislators where if they don't know a person with a developmental disability, this is so niche as to not really speak to them. But when they do, they get really well informed and passionate pretty fast. And I think that happens to all of us. And therefore, community integration itself is the single best anti-stigma tool that we have. So like saving the community-based system and making it robust enough to do what we've always wanted it to do seems more important than ever, given that we just spent a whole year calling direct support professionals angels, but not paying them like angels. So anyway, just my pound on the table moment for you.
Well, I think another thing that kind of shows I don't know what the right adjective is the money spent for state-operated developmental centers, what it costs per year, per day for an individual in those. And again, it's hard to say that because I live in the community of Fox Center, and I visited almost all the other ones, and Fox is like the top of the rung for sure. But I mean, the money that could be saved and used for our community day service, or all of our community services, in any direction from those state funds is just makes no sense.
Christine. Meg, I'll let you go.
No.
You may
So I
feel
wasn't
differently
gonna do
tomorrow. I don't
some
know.
whatever. What I was gonna say is, I mean, I think considering politics for the next couple of years, in my mind, I think a place where we could all really move the needle is thinking about how do we stop people from going into SODCs. And so figuring out what services and supports they need. You all do ton of wraparound, right? Like you really fund a lot of things that aren't funded. So what are those? And then really pushing to have a clear and robust transition process for people that includes a solid community-based team approach. And in my mind, those two things then were, especially before an election of a new governor or the governor, we're definitely not going to get, unfortunately, or any specific statement about that. However, if we can shrink the numbers, that I think is a huge, and the work that you all do can really help with that, I think, personally.
As a provider organization, and speaking as its head, I believe we need to get back as soon as is reasonably possible to a dialogue about what it means and what it looks like to move away from the institutional service options that we have. Meg has looked at this a lot. She knows what the tier 1 numbers look like in terms of individuals that are actively seeking. We have a political issue with this, and we always have. And I don't want to, cast aspersions at bargaining units that are representing their members. I get that, and it's a real issue. And when you get in the halls of government, you realize that compromise has to come about. It simply does, because there are different interests. But thinking of persons first, as I know Meg always does, we need to get back to that. And I think it's incumbent on this administration, with the time it has, and who knows what the future holds, but that needs to be on the table, especially in a post-pandemic environment where we saw the effect of the coronavirus in those settings. Our ability as community providers to be able to serve individuals more and more with comorbid conditions, we need to get this rate study funded. It's crucial in a lot of that respects. I know that there are dollars that go with transitions into the community, but until we can have an equitable funding or an equitable service array, the referrals that providers are getting on a regular basis will continue to go unfilled until they're able to staff. But I am one of those leaders that agrees we need to get back to this. We want to work on this. We haven't been able to have this discussion for a number of years, and it's not going to be easy, but it can be done. We have some infrastructure improvements that we need to make, but I'm looking forward to seeing Meg's plan tomorrow when she goes in by the end of the day.
I don't start till the
Speaking.
5th. I don't start till
Okay. I'm sorry, on the 5th, but Meg, I know that that's important to you, and I know it will come up in conversations internally. And my hope is that I'm around to be a part of it as well.
Thanks.
Can I bring up one other little thing?
Yep.
Real quick, and whoever responds to it is the number of hours, the 1,100 hours. I mean, the agencies are looking to us to fund they're out of funds, or they're out of billable hours to the state by, March, April. So I'll leave it at that.
Meg, I don't know if you got any inside baseball. That's not fair to me to ask. This is an issue. So, as many of you know, to try to respond flexibly in the mid-pandemic environment, so organizations were allowed to bill for those hours essentially, but they were expected to coordinate with the day service providers to not end up in the place that we're in now. First of all, we always end up in this place, day service providers, as you mentioned, Christine, every year, but it's exacerbated further. And as we get to this point where vaccinations are prevalent, individuals are wanting to go back, providers are wanting to open up. From my perspective, unless I hear differently later this week from our committee, there needs to be more hours allocated, and that is a budgetary issue. From the numbers that we're seeing, we think based on the appropriations spend, the division could potentially afford some dollars in this space, but I don't see the numbers that they see internally. We know the last quarter of this fiscal year, all HCBS expenditures will get a 10% bump on their Medicaid. There could be dollars there that could be supplemental appropriated. I don't talk to the director as much as I used to, but I know this is on her radar. And if there's anybody that's going to be able to figure this out to the extent she's able, it's going to be her and perhaps Meg on the inside. So hopefully we can see some movement there, but who knows? Things are tight in state government with dollars. The department and the division are doing the best they can. I hope we can see something on this soon because, I share the concerns there.
Just one other thing because I know we're over time, I apologize, but I think, we're still, I'm sure Josh has done a back of the envelope on what money will be coming down from the latest, CARES to ARA, Rescue Act. And there is included in that a bump specifically for home and community-based services. And so the hope, obviously that's not ongoing funds, but the hope is to try to invest in some way and I would argue, to try to cover that gap, which is going to be really bad this year in May and June. Could be one place, and that's just me speaking as the ARC exec. But then the other thing would be, this is really an advocacy point. The Guidehouse in their rate study spoke to the 1,200 hour or the 1,100 hours and trying to fix that. So as we advocate for that, that's definitely a place where we'd love to see funding.
It's temporary for now, Lynn, but I already trying. There's going to be 2 more reconciliation packages that are the opportunity to go through before the end of the federal fiscal year. I guarantee to you every effort is going to be to try to continue that. And I have hope because President Biden, he announced a jobs plan today. I need to read the fact sheet, but on campaign, he committed to $450 billion for HCBS services over 10 years. So there's an ally in the White House in that respect. Collective bargaining is doing a very good job federally to draw attention to the need to have funding in the space. So I know every legislator we talk to about, but there's a time limit on that. I get that, but I don't know. I think, if you look at the history of Medicaid rate bumps that have been pulled after a time frame, it works in our favor.
Okay.
One thing I just want to share before we're done, if I could, and then I'll be quiet. We've talked a lot about COVID vaccine, COVID impact. I got a slide from a presentation yesterday that I hope should give us all hope. As of March 30th, 52.6 million or 16% of the population were fully vaccinated, 29% at least one dose, 2.76 million average vaccinations per day. Here's the thing that stands out to me. It is estimated date that 70% of the United States population will at least be partially vaccinated, and that's the herd immunity number by June 16th. So as we continue to bring vaccines online, as Johnson & Johnson ramps up its production, hopefully we can get an AstraZeneca soon, although I don't think that'll be the next one. Heading to a new normal, hopefully by the middle of the summer, and I think we could all use it.
Great. Well, thank you so much. And there was so much great interaction and discussion. I think, Meg, you had posted contact information regarding the next, before the next ED is hired, and then Josh's email is also on there. So I don't know, will you share the presentation? We can share that with anybody who's interested. We can email that out if Meg wants to send that to me after the webinar. But thank you both so much. And thank you to everybody that joined us today. This was really great. We appreciate it. Look forward to seeing you all on our next one in May.
Thank you so much for the invitation.
Yes,
Thank
thanks,
you.
Lynn. Thank you, Jody. Thanks,
Thank you.
everyone. Thanks, Ron. Have a wonderful afternoon.
You too. Take care.